to our conversation on Europe. My name is Ron Linden. I'm director of the European Union Center of Excellence European Studies Center here at the University of Pittsburgh. I want to welcome to this session our sister university centers of excellence for the EU at Wisconsin, Illinois. I think Miami is to join us, although I don't see them yet. I want to thank the technical people who have made this possible by making the connections possible, and especially Alison Delnor on my right, Associate Director of our center, who does all the work to make this happen. Let me take the opportunity to mention our next event, which is at noon on Thursday. Dr. Francesco Vassallo from the University of Southern Maine will talk about the evolution of EU support in France, true Euroscepticism or simple volatility. That's at noon in this room. And next Tuesday, in a Pizza and Politics presentation, Ayselin Yildiz will talk about decentralization, interactive governance, and income inequality in Spain and Sweden. Today, we will address the topic of, does Turkey have a European future, which I'll come back to in a moment. I'm going to try to keep us to about an hour, because at least one of our guests has to leave then, and my students will come up here and bodily drag me down to class if I'm late, I'm sure. So we'll shoot for that. Let me thank and introduce at the same time the panelists for today's discussion, beginning with Sinan Ülgen, who is joining us from Brussels, where he is a visiting scholar at Carnegie Europe in Brussels. Sinan is a founding partner of Istanbul Economics and the chairman of the Center for Economics and Foreign Policy Studies, İDAM, where I first met him. He is a veteran of the Turkish Foreign Service and a regular contributor and commentator on Turkish affairs. Actually, most recently, I found him on CNN, but it's probably been 10 more comments since then. Uli Schamiloglu from the University of Wisconsin is professor in the Department of Languages and Culture and chair of both the Central Asian Program and the Middle East Studies Program at Wisconsin. He works on cultural and linguistic issues and a topic which I hope we won't touch on today, which is the Black Death. So I think things may be pessimistic, but perhaps not that bad. My friend Henri Barkey is joining us. He is the Bernard and Bertha Cohen Professor and Chair of the Department of International Relations at Lehigh University. He too had a connection with Carnegie in their Middle East program in Washington. He too worked in the US Foreign Service and policy planning, and he too is an author and commentator, most recently quoted this past weekend actually in the New York Times about recent events in Turkey. One of our partners is joining us from Turkey. Ayselin Yildiz is here she is director of the EU Center at Yaşar University in Izmir, one of our center's partners on a project. She's also assistant professor in the Department of Political Science and focuses in her work on Turkey-EU relations, as many of the people on this panel do. The decade, if you look back over a decade to about 2004 till, say, next year, it has been an extraordinarily turbulent time in global politics, in Middle Eastern politics, in European politics and economics, in energy markets and supply. There have been wars in the Middle East, wars in the Caucasus, the completion of the EU enlargement project, but then a subsequent loss of dynamics and political elan. There was great hope with the Arab Spring, which has perhaps collapsed into a situation which will bring us, at best, uncertainty, at worst, a new kind of dictatorship. The United States teeters on the edge of involvement in many of these events, especially in the Middle East, even as it exits from extensive involvement in the Middle East. US-Russian relations have not quite reset as they were expected to, and Iran seems to have gone from a period of radical assertion of foreign policy prerogatives to apparent accommodation with Western concerns. In the middle of all of these lies Turkey. Am I going to get there? Like it or not, Turkey and its neighbors, to quote the title of a runaway bestseller. You may see some content coming up, which will be a map of Turkey. There's our logo. There's the map of Turkey, just in case you didn't know where it was. Turkey's in the middle of all of these things. Like it or not, having effective policies to deal with it or not. You can look at this from a number of perspectives, both domestic and international. And today I want to address, and I want our panel to address, what all of this means, Turkey's reaction to these changes and its policies mean for its European future. I phrase it that way on purpose because it applies to Turkey's present and future course and asks the question if that is a European course or not, however one might define it. That intersects with the question of EU membership, which I'm sure we'll touch on, but is not the whole question, because there are broader implications for Turkish foreign policy, its relations with the West, including the United States, economics and energy, and, of course, domestic politics. With that scene setter, I'd like to begin with domestic politics and ask our panelists, and I may not get to everybody on every question, and by the way, I should also add that there may be others who want to add questions, and you should indicate that, those of you that have done this in the past, if you raise your hand, Allison will unmute you, and that applies to both panelists and students and faculty at our sister universities who want to speak. If you raise your hand, we can see you, and we'll unmute you, and you can join the conversation unless I don't like the question, in which case we'll mute you again. Sinan, I'd like to ask you to address the recent democracy package that was put forth by the government. I've lost count at how many there have been now. This is the most recent one, and it included some important cultural aspects with regard to Kurdish, some political changes, the reduction of the cutoff level in parliament. But in your comments in the Financial Times, you argue that this did not go far enough. I wonder if you would elaborate on that and tell us what else is needed for Turkey to put forth what you might call a genuine democratization package.
Absolutely, and thanks a lot, Ron, for the invitation to participate in this, multipolar panel. Now, since I made those comments to the FT, my opinion has actually even strengthened. Can you hear me fine? Is this okay?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Because this package is also quite interesting in looking at what is absent from the package, because many people tended to comment what's in there. But as interesting as that is to look at what's not in the package. Because if indeed this is, as it's purported to be by the government, a very significant package that is set to improve democratic standards in Turkey, it had to have a number of additional elements. One, it does not contain any provisions to redress one of the sore points in Turkey's democracy today, which is the freedom of expression and freedom of association. Secondly, it does not have any provisions related to yet another deficit of the Turkish system, which is the independence and the impartiality of the judiciary. And thirdly, and this has been expressed, is it falls far short of the expectations regarding minority rights, and in particular related to the rights of the Alevi minority in Turkey. So, to summarize, these are really the areas where a more serious, a more complete, a more comprehensive democratization package should certainly have incorporated. And that is the reason why generally the reaction in Turkey has been along the lines of what I said before, which is, of course, this is a good thing. It does have some provisions that is likely to improve democratic standards in Turkey, but it certainly doesn't go far enough. And it also lacks a number of fundamental pillars that will make this a more substantive reform package.
Henri, can I ask you to comment on the politics of this package? If Sinan's indication that it is fairly limited, we also see that it removed, for example, the ban on headscarves for women, with some exceptions, working in Turkey. I wonder is this about as far as this government can go because of domestic politics? Is it afraid to go too far because of a nationalist backlash? And is this the most that we can expect out of a regime which has a pretty secure majority in parliament?
Well, let me say, I agree with everything Sinan said. The reason it's not going to go forward at the moment is because you have 3 elections coming up. You have municipal elections, you have presidential elections, and then you have national elections. So from that perspective, the government is trying to make sure that it doesn't really upset any large group of people, but it is also part and parcel of the strategy that the government has shown so far, which is it always improves the situation by small steps, which gives you the impression that yes, this is a small step, but there will be more steps. Whether those next steps come will depend on whether or not the government assesses that there is enough pressure, there is enough demand, there is enough political space to do it. But there's one issue, I have to say, is over which I am not sure that the government itself is really willing to go very far, and that's the Alevi question. And that's because fundamentally, this government, this movement that this government represents, does not really regard the Alevis as real Muslims and has a very, very, very hard time making kind of a peace with that movement. So they will try to kick that ball down as far as possible before making any kind of significant change on the Alevi front. They will do other little things that will be signs, and they think that will satisfy people. But there's a dynamic here which the government doesn't understand. Like, take the Kurdish question, for instance. There has been moves in favor of the Kurdish question, but the expectations of the Kurdish population is not so far ahead of where the government is. And the same thing is happening to the Alevi population. When they make small changes and adaptations, in fact, it pushes expectations even further, and it makes it much more difficult. So I think they're going to be in a bind, but they're going to have to. The big test is in March with the municipal elections, and then I think they will reassess.
Uli, let me ask you to draw out this question of the Alevi. I think even people who pay attention to Turkey in the West are unfamiliar with the significance of this group and its importance in Turkey and maybe in the region. Can you address that, and do you agree with Henri's assessment of where they stand in the situation right now in terms of human rights in Turkey?
Well, thank you for calling on me. It's an honor to participate, and you called on me about half a second before I was about to raise my hand to follow up on what Professor Barkey was saying. If I may make 2 quick notes. First of all, I think the issue of allowing Kurdish in schools was limited to private institutions. And I still am trying to figure out what that was about, unless it was to hedge its bets, that it wasn't going to be in state schools, it would only be in private schools. So I would agree with Professor Barkey that that's really kind of only a half-hearted measure that's going to lead to greater expectations, but at the same time disappoints. The other point that I would like to make is a greater point, and then I'll get to the Alevi question. The greater point is that, I've been observing this government talking about democratization, talking about a new constitution and so on, and it's almost a misnomer to call it a democratization packet when it's totally non-transparent and it's totally not democratic. It's almost that the Erdoğan government really does not try to engage the population as a whole, and it's really like what's coming out of the black box, and it's going to be a surprise to everybody. So I don't know if anybody wants to comment on that later. Now, with regard to the Alevi situation, so I don't claim to be an authority on the Alevis by any stretch of the imagination. The Alevis are like they're more orthodox Sunni would not consider them to be, fully Sunni. They are kind of a combination of popular Islam and folk Shiism and so on. And there's, a very important concentration of them through the eastern and southern part. It carries over as a continuum into Syria, and it leads to, there's all kinds of regional implications there. Just like with the Kurdish problem, it's not a problem that's limited to the Turkish boundaries. Now, there was a recent suggestion by the exiled spiritual leader Fethullah Gülen, whose name is probably known to all of you, suggesting or making a proposal to have some kind of a shared a religious facility, I believe in Ankara, where the same courtyard would have a Sunni mosque and an Alevi cemevi, or their congregational house, because their worships are sort of different. The way they worship is sort of different. And I think that, that met with all kinds of criticism. So I think Professor Barkey is absolutely right that there's a real big problem reconciling the kind of the Sunni outlook of the Erdoğan government with having totally some kind of seamless interaction with the Alevis. Just one additional footnote, and then I'll stop, is that if we observe the way Erdoğan was supporting the Morsi government in Egypt, I mean, it seems that, if anything, Erdoğan was taking a pro-Muslim Brotherhood kind of a position, and they seem to have, they come out intellectually out of the same mix. So I think that's part of the problem, that if anything, Erdoğan has this very, very, pro-Orthodox leanings, which is making it difficult to have, a true reconciliation with the Alevis, who are main supporters of the CHP too.
Ayselin, I saw you had your hand up. Please, go ahead.
Yes. I would like to contribute by telling that indeed, yes, the expectation was more. But however, I find democratization package as like a simple step for further progress. And we should underline that the domestic politics in Turkey nowadays, especially in the last few months, the tensions are really high. So there are many other issues going on together, like we have the constitution debate, we have the peace process going on another hand, and it's clearly underlined also by the EU progress report. There are some missing points that Turkey lags behind in terms of freedom of expression, association, and minority rights. But however, concerning these high tensions in Turkey, and especially the Syrian case, on the other hand, and the upcoming elections, so the democratization package was a simple one, but I think we should say it brings indeed a good step for progress. It's not nothing, but it is something. So we can I believe the governments later on is now opening a space for further reforms. We expect it. But when we look at the practice, the cases like now we have a civil society more active in Turkey. We can talk about such initiatives as also underlined by the progress report. However, there are some kind of violent attitudes towards the demonstration and protest. So we are discussing democratization a lot in Turkey, especially by the young generation. So the package is something good. I'm hopeful, but on the other hand, the practice shows us something different.
I'd like to ask the panelists to consider if there is a European aspect to this. Sinan, let me embarrass you further by quoting you. you wrote in your report about divorce, between a virtual divorce, I think you called it, which made me wonder about whether I missed a marriage there, because I'm not sure Turkey and the EU have ever been married yet to be divorced. But you wrote, the remoteness of the full membership objective has visibly undermined Turkey's democratic practice. That suggests that it matters some what the EU says about both this package and Turkey's democratic project, you might say, overall. Do you think that is still true? Would you go so far as to say this package is in response to that? Or what prospect do you see for EU influence going forward?
EU is perhaps a quite minor element of this package. The real motivation behind this package are twofold. One is this is an alternative for the constitution in the making, because the government party had promised a new constitution in the 2011 elections, and they have been unable to deliver that. And there were a lot of hopes pinned on the constitution, but it was increasingly clear that the country was not able to put together a constitution by consensus. And therefore, the fallback scenario was this democratization package. That is one of the main, if you want, drivers. The second driver is the increasing awareness among the Turkish leadership, including the Prime Minister, that a lot of harm has been done to the government's image after the Gezi protests. The government's image has been greatly tarnished by the way that they have reacted to the Gezi protests. So the second reason was to eliminate some of that or to overcome some of that tarnished image. The EU is perhaps a distant third in terms of the main drivers for this package, essentially because the Turkey-EU relationship has become so weak that gone are really the days where the EU was a big factor in driving Turkish reforms. Now, having said that, I must also say that we are speaking on a day where the EU, after a 3-year hiatus, decided to open a new chapter with Turkey, and I suppose we can comment that later on.
Actually, this leads us into that issue. What are we to make of this reversal? It has been 3 years. It is only one chapter, but it is something, and it could only go forward, as you well know, if the Germans and the French and others did not veto it, which they apparently did not. I guess what I'm trying to figure out is this government really interested in this process? You get 2 kinds of statements from Prime Minister Erdoğan, nasty ones and none. Sometimes he doesn't mention it at all, but when he does, it's critical. Egemen Bayish himself said he didn't think Turkey would ever join, and he's the negotiator for Turkey's EU membership. So is this a new step forward, or will it just be more disappointment? Ayselin, since you had an EU center, I'm going to ask you to address that first.
Yeah, indeed, I agree with what Sinan says. Is the EU process, EU process has a minor effect on this democratization reform package. However, it's in our foreign policy, it's an irrevocable process. It's a part of EU's foreign policy. Although the relations have been stagnated for a while, we can say that there were very bad statements from each side. Not only from Turkish politicians, but also we heard like train crash issue, like the Sarkozy statement, Merkel statement. So all these have an impact on the society, that the credibility of the EU among the Turkish society has been decreasing. And this stagnation of relations have led the Turkish foreign policy a kind of shift towards other regions as well, like North Africa and Middle East. And I don't find this as a wrong attitude, as long as we keep on going with the EU process, because Turkey, in terms of its geopolitical situation, in my opinion, should have a multidimensional foreign policy, and it can utilize its geostrategic and historical advantages as well. However, this doesn't mean that the EU process should be like put aside. EU still has an impact on Turkey's good democratization and Turkey's progress. So although the relations have seemed to be stagnated, and today we had the news like we are going to have one more chapter opening on regional policy, which I believe is one of the really very critical and very important issues in Turkey concerning all these regional disparities. And this is also a good step. So I don't think that the policies, the politicians, the statements can continue. You know, like it always happened. We remember Verheugen for a while. You know, we had very critical moments in EU-Turkey relations before. But this process is, in my opinion, is an irrevocable one that Turkey-EU relations, I believe, will continue, whether slowly, but will continue, and although there are many critical times like we experienced before.
I just put up a slide from EDAM's last public opinion survey, which is very distressing. I'm sure you're aware of
yes.
it. It shows that fully two-thirds of the Turkish public is not interested in pursuing EU membership. And I began by talking about the decade. In 2004, a similar survey showed 75% of the Turkish public in favor. So, in a sense, not only without public support, but with public indifference or hostility, one might be persuaded that the EU is really a minor player. The regime, in a sense, doesn't have to concern itself because the public either doesn't care or is hostile. Do you have a question from Illinois? Miami. Well, welcome.
Welcome. We are here.
In addition, the public opinion, one might argue, wavers and varies, but it's also to be noted that the EU share in Turkish trade, which used to hover around 50%, is now closer to 38%. So one might reasonably ask that, or assume that Turkey's not interested anymore and it's backing it up with actions. Henri, I saw your hand.
Trade is wrong because what has happened in Turkey's foreign trade is that Turkey has become a much larger exporter, a much larger economy. The fact that the relative share of Europe has gone down doesn't mean that it's uninterested in Europe or that Europe is not an important component of its economy. It's just that Turkey has found new markets. I mean, the pie has gotten larger. So people who make that analogy, I think, are making a terrible mistake, because I think European investments, all you have to do is go to Istanbul and you see, I mean, Europe is very much part, at least, of Istanbul and Western Turkey in terms of companies, investments, tourism. So that's one point. The other, but I think more fundamentally, is the fact that a lot of us thought that at the beginning, when the AKP government, and I was one of them, came to power, and the first speech that Erdoğan gave was, we are going to join Europe. And I think it's becoming increasingly apparent that Europe was really an instrument rather than a strategy. That is to say, it was an instrument to defeat certain parts of the opposition in Turkey. And it is not something that they genuinely necessarily believe. Maybe they did, but they changed their mind. What I want to do is just look at the rhetoric that's coming out from government officials, from members of Erdoğan's administration, from Erdoğan about Europe and the West. You would think that the main enemy is Europe and the West. I mean, after all, it is Lufthansa that organized the Gezi protest. It is Germany that is trying to undermine this government. It's the Germans who are against the peace process. Now, you are trying to join a group of countries in which Germany is the most important, and yet the rhetoric coming out of Ankara and Istanbul, in the press, in the talk shows, in public, is virulently anti-European. And you realize that Turkey has not made its peace with Europe yet. I think what Ayselin said is true. It's going to be a much longer process. Europe was sold to Turkey, or Turkey was sold to Europe as, once the accession negotiations start, in 10 years, like every other country, Turkey will become a member. No. Turkey is a much bigger fish, much larger problems, much more difficult for Europe to integrate. But also, Turkey's own attitude towards Europe being so confused and so fraught with uncertainty, that this is going to be a much longer process. So yes, one chapter is going to be open today. It may take another year or two for another chapter to be open, but this is going to be a very, very, very long haul. And if the public is not interested now, it's just a temporary reflection that can change very easily.
Uli, let me pick up on Henri's last comment to ask you an impossible question, really. And it has to do with the notion of Turkish identity. I think when the process began, the automatic assumption was that Turks saw themselves as Europeans, wanted to be part of it, felt they belonged there, and Turkish identity was wrapped up. Is that still true, or has the notion of what it means to be Turkish now, or to be part of the Turkish state, changed?
I don't think that's such an impossible question. And if before trying to answer that, if I can just make one additional note on what Professor Barkey said, and I was trying to say something before, I think we've kind of forgotten about the various national economic crises in Europe, thinking about Greece, thinking about Spain, Italy, Portugal, Ireland, and so on. So we're talking as though Germany is Europe, and Germany is the banker for the rest of Europe right now. So I would say that my reading of the opinion polls is that where if 10 years ago large segments of the Turkish population saw economic opportunity in Europe, I think a lot of that does not really appear in their imagination right now. And of course, that can change. There's an awful lot going on in Turkey because of the policies of the Erdoğan government. And I think we need to remember, their foreign policy in the Middle East is in shambles. The whole notion of no inimical relations with neighbors and so on. But, as a part of doing that, they opened up their boundaries to a no-visa regime for 30 days with Syria. They're doing that with Russia. I'm not sure about all of the other countries. So I think during this time of economic crisis in Europe, the Erdoğan government was very much looking to kind of revive the image of Turkey as a leader in the Middle East the way it was during the Ottoman Empire. So I think kind of the government's view of its historical mission may see itself more as being a leader in the Middle East rather than being a leader in Europe. And as an aside, I would just say that I can never imagine Europe deciding that you should have a huge voting bloc of Turkish citizens in the European Parliament, which is why I just assume that they're dragging it out for the next 30, 50, or 100 years. But so, the notion that Turkey had a close relationship with Assad and that they can then later on decide that relationship is broken and Assad is a murderer and he needs to leave, or trying, very, very hard to help, Morsi stay in power in Egypt, I think shows that Turkey sees itself as a leader there. And to the extent that you have to, or they're trying to co-opt the Kurdish groups and the Alevis and so on, I think perforce they have to kind of tone down the nationalist rhetoric, which is not, I think, really in Erdogan's heart anyway. I mean, I think to the extent that they can become more of a Muslim state or an Islamically oriented state, it means that then you're going to turn down the volume on the national side. So I think there is a big question in Turkey as to how Turkish, the national character and the national identity is going to be in the future.
Sinan.
Yes, just allow me a few comments. on where we stand with regard to Europe and, the next few years possibly, because I partially agree with Henri. When we hear about the words patience and it's going to take a long number of years, Turks don't have the patience to hear that anymore because the relationship is now 50 years old almost. But he's right in saying that there's now very little willingness left on the side of the government for serious EU-linked reforms. The situation, the politics of it are very different than what existed when the negotiations started in 2004, 2005. Today, the Prime Minister himself does not see the EU as his ally. He used to see the EU as his ally politically in Turkey a few years back. That's not the case anymore. And also, as some of the other panelists have pointed out, the EU's image has been greatly tarnished by the economic crisis. Now, as a result, it is probably quite safe to ascertain that the relationship will not move forward except a few symbolic gestures here and there under present circumstances. What may happen, though, and this is where people like me continue to push this agenda, is that we may see the emergence of a new Europe in the wake of the Euro crisis, which might mean Europe with a different architecture, with a core Europe based on the Eurozone and its governance, and outer layers, which will include countries like the UK, possibly Sweden, and so on. That sort of architecture, that sort of geography will reset the Turkey-EU relationship. And that's going to happen much sooner than the long years of patience that Henri alluded to. That will happen over the next few years. And with that sort of Europe emerging, the Turkey-EU relationship, to borrow that term from the US-Russia relationship, will be reset. It will be reset on a new path of accession, but that accession will be accession to a different Europe. That's what I wanted to say.
About 5 years ago, an EU official came to Pittsburgh, and I asked him if, maybe it was more, 6 or 7, if he thought Turkey would become a member of the EU. And he said, yes, but not this EU. I took it to mean something along the lines that you were suggesting, that it will look a lot different with an inner core and outer core. That may happen regardless of what happens with Turkey, if you consider British objections or British concerns. That it may move in that direction. I can't tell if Ayselin is raising her hand. Ayselin, go ahead.
Yeah, it's just a very short comment. I totally agree what Sinan says, because how the EU will change, whether it will move towards the model of maybe a differentiated integration model, or a core Europe, or a multi-speed Europe, will strongly affect how the EU-Turkey relations will develop. And indeed, if you look at the negotiation framework of Turkey, it says that even although all chapters are successfully negotiated, the Turkey's full membership is not certain. EU can put some provisional safeguards and some measures, evenly successfully close all the chapters. So indeed, this shows us a different model where Turkey can integrate with the EU. So if the EU now is having all these economic crises and all these debates, maybe it will be a more multi-speed Europe, or it will be more with like differentiated membership models like UK did. Maybe it will have some opt-outs in some policies. So under these dynamics and framework, the Turkey's situation in the changing architecture of Europe can differ a lot. And that's why maybe the Turkish politicians and the society are not like, oh, okay, we are so much keen with the EU. But if you just look at the Egemen Bağış comment after the regular report, he said, we did this for the good benefit of our people. So it's like, we see EU as like an instrument for the reforms, a pushing power, but it's a strategic aim. It is irrevocable. However, the changing dynamics in EU will determine a lot the Turkey's new position in the EU.
When I read Bayesh's comment, I must say I was reminded of Sinan's metaphor of divorce, because he said, now we're through with all those illogical, unnecessary, and meaningless obstacles. It sounded like an old married couple squabbling over who didn't do the dishes or something. And it reminded me, it was a kind of a testy comment, I thought. But Uli mentioned the Middle East, and I really want to get us to focus a little bit on that, because of the link, of the possible link, and I'd like the panelists to think about that, the possible link between what is clearly a collapsed Turkish policy in the Middle East and what you might call a reinvigoration of an interest in Europe. Let's pose that as a possibility. Turks have learned what the British, the French, and the US have learned at painful cost in the Middle East, which is they can't control the outcomes. And Erdoğan and the Turkish model, so to speak, have gone from the image of the future to playing catch up and finding themselves actually having alienated virtually all sides in Syria, all sides in Iraq. Their people are kidnapped in Lebanon. And I suppose we can, but we should take note of the rather bizarre episode of the Turks revealing the identity of Israeli Mossad agents to the Iranians. Maybe we'll come back to that. Could we see out of this what you might call a pivot towards Europe? And I might point out that Turkish exports to the Middle East are down 13% in the last year, not surprisingly, given what's happened there. If the Middle East isn't going to be what the government thought it would for the Turks, economically, politically, for the image, then will they not turn back towards Europe? Henri. And am I missing something else? Henri, go ahead.
3 years ago, we wouldn't have had this conversation. We would have been talking about the Turkish model for the Arab Spring, and how high Turkey was sailing in these turbulent waters. Look, there's been all these undulations, if you want. 10 years is not a very long time in the history of a country, in the foreign policy of a country, to essentially suddenly come up with very, shall we say, dramatic conclusions like Turkey's policy has collapsed. The truth is, there's one critical issue here, and that's Syria. Imagine for a moment that Assad is gone tomorrow. He won't be, but let's assume he's gone. Turkey's position changes dramatically overnight in that respect. So I think at this stage we shouldn't say that Turkish policy has completely collapsed. What has happened? The problem, there was nothing wrong with the basic principle of Turkish foreign policy as it initially was announced, so to say. What was wrong was the hubris that came with it. The hubris that essentially is what alienated people, not just, by the way, in the Middle East, but elsewhere as well, in Europe certainly. It's this overpromise. But fundamentally, the Middle East for Turkey was the low-hanging fruit. It was a place it had not really ventured. It was markets that it could conquer for its businesses, and it did, and that was very smart. The problem was that Davutoglu and Erdoğan essentially came with a rhetoric that did not justify. That was not justified by policies, by capabilities that Turkey had at the time. So it overpromised, and it said, Davutoglu's famous comment that the Middle East is being reshaped and Turkey is going to be its leader, and that was completely outrageous on his part. So Turkey is not going to pivot to Europe because of what's happening in the Middle East. Turkey is going to continue, as I said, to engage in as many parts of the world as it can, because it is essentially a much more powerful economic actor, and that is what is really driving everything.
I want to give our audience, either here at the University of Pittsburgh or at our sister centers, an opportunity to ask any of our panelists a question on these or related topics. Please just identify yourself and your institution.
I'm Harry Klapsis. I'm an undergraduate here at the University of Pittsburgh. And my question is to the big news, at least for me, with Cyprus and the upcoming negotiations that are about to take place. And recently it was in the news that Erdoğan and Ankara has shown a willingness, and they will accept the Greek Cypriot negotiator in Ankara to talk, something that the Cypriots have wanted for quite some time. And I was just wondering, in the panelists' view, if this is signaling a change in the shift of Ankara in regards to Cyprus, and is there a solution to the Cyprus problem coming? I know I might have just opened a can of worms there, so.
And I thought I asked an impossible question. Any takers? I can't see. Okay, Sinan.
Let me start with the easy one. Of course, there's a solution to the Cyprus problem. Everybody knows that solution. That solution is the one that will be, very close to what the Annan plan was in 2004. So it's not so much whether we know how the solution would be. It is whether, there is enough of a political incentive on both sides to make that solution happen. And so far, it was, the Greek Cypriot side that lacked a true incentive to negotiate in good faith. In the sense that in 2004, when they became members of the EU, there was very little that they had not obtained. So now things are changing on two accounts. One is the big economic crisis and on the Cypriot part of the island. The conditions imposed by the Troika on the Cypriots. And secondly, these offshore gas resources in the Eastern Mediterranean. Because they should realize, and they are realizing, that the settlement with Turkey, a settlement of the Cyprus problem, it will then allow, the true leveraging of these gas resources, which would be a big boon to the Cypriot economy. If there's no settlement, it's going to be much more difficult. I'm not saying impossible, but much more difficult for the Cypriots to really benefit from these resources, especially in the shorter time frame. So I think these two new elements are changing the political framework. The Greek Cypriots have a new president, Anastasiades, who actually voted yes for the Annan plan in 2004. That is also, a good sign. And now with Turkey accepting to meet the Greek Cypriot negotiator along with the Turkish Cypriot negotiator is also a sign of, of good faith. So I certainly hope that we shall see movement on Cyprus. But it's been such an intractable problem for over the years that, it's difficult to say whether this time around this will happen or not.
Every once in a while, I get
there is reason to be optimistic. More optimistic than in the past decade, let's say. There is a window of opportunity.
Every once in a while, I get a phone call from my son, and he'll ask me, "How are things going, Dad?" And I'll say, "I think the Mideast peace process is in trouble." And I'm reminded of that when I hear about optimism on Cyprus. But I would like to introduce one more subject, which is perhaps the most, I suppose, dear to us, but leads to some of the most heated rhetoric, and that is relations between Turkey and the United States. In a very recent piece, Stephen Cook of the Council on Foreign Relations wondered in print, how can the Obama administration continue to tout Turkey as a model partner or even treat it as an ally? He says, we have crossed the line of reasonable disagreement and arrived at a point where Turkey is very clearly and very actively working to subvert American aims in the Middle East on a host of issues. Among the issues that are known to people who pay attention are differences over Iran and how to deal with it, different sides of the current government and opposition in Egypt, profoundly different views of what is and should happen in Syria, and of course, the complete deterioration of Turkish-Israeli relations. And just in case anybody thought all of those were fixable, the Turks have bought a Chinese missile system instead of one produced by whatever American contractor would have produced it. In the face of this, is Cook's assessment too harsh, or is he being too easy? Henri?
I think Steve is a little bit being a provocateur here. There's no question that there are serious differences and serious issues now between Turkey and the United States, and the May visit of Prime Minister Erdoğan to Washington did not go well, certainly not as well as the Turkish press wanted to describe it. And the major difference was, I think, at the time of a Turkish support for al-Nusra elements in Syria. But generally, I think we would be exaggerating if we go as far as Steve is going in terms of saying, is Turkey really an ally? The truth is, people tend to forget this. But when I worked in the State Department, I have to tell you that Turkey was always the most difficult client to have. And this is, when you ask Turks today, Turks think that the current Turkish policy is really independent and that somehow the governments of Ecevit or military tutelage were really subservient to the United States. I can tell you that in our relationship with the Turks, it was always the first word that came out of their mouth usually was no. And then you had to negotiate, right? So it isn't, I don't think things are that different. The difference now is that there's a rhetoric that is associated with it. And that's the unfortunate part of it, because what you see, what happened after Gezi, it wasn't the police reaction that upset people in the United States and in Europe. It is the discourse that the government started in terms of trying to explain why Gezi occurred and essentially blaming outsiders, as I mentioned earlier, interstate lobby and all that kind of stuff. And that showed essentially that fundamentally there's really not only distrust between the two sides, but that there is a fundamental dislike, if you want, on the part of the government. And that is what I think Steve is coming from. I think that is what is worrying him. But what I'm trying to say that in the earlier days, the same distrust between Turkey and the United States existed. It's not, nations don't love each other. States have relations, and Turkey and the United States will continue to work together, And I want to point out just one little thing. This Hakan Fidan story of him leaking out the names of the Israeli Mossad agents was known at the time when Erdogan visited to the administration in May, and yet Fidan was invited to the White House. Now, Congress will be upset when now that the stuff has come out. But the point I'm trying to say is that even when countries burn you, you still continue to work with each other because you have to. Your interests determine everything else. So we shouldn't, I think Steve is going a little bit too far, but he's pointing out to this other factor, which is this dislike that's coming out from Ankara.
Uli, let me ask you to comment on that, on what you might say at the level of, not exactly personal, but this level of dislike, which I have to tell you as a political scientist, we have a very hard time quantifying, and therefore we just exclude it.
Okay, well, I'm glad to. If I can just first make one footnote that I looked a little bit into the issue of the Chinese missile system, and as far as I understand, that Turkey announced that they selected that, but they have not signed any contract. And it's pointed out sometimes that the U.S. was able to convince Israel twice to not do something like that. So that's probably not a done deal yet. And I see that more as posturing, but it is playing with the NATO relationship. And I think that's playing with fire on Erdogan's part. In terms of the U.S., relationship with Turkey and Middle East policy, I would be very hesitant to say that the United States has had an enlightened policy in the Middle East. I was in Taksim Square the day the Turkish parliament voted not to support a northern route into Iraq. And I think that the United States has seen Turkey going from a wildly supportive, enthusiastic popular response to the United States to having a huge level of anti-Americanism because of the critical foreign policy mistakes the United States has made in the Middle East. So I'm not sure that it's such a bad thing that allies of the United States, are hesitant to support it 100%, because there have been so many strategic blunders in the Middle East. I can comment further, but I'm sure somebody else would like to step in and respond to that.
Go ahead, Andy. I'm putting up the most recent transatlantic trends survey done by the German Marshall Fund. It just disappeared. Homeland Security took it off, and its approval of Obama's. This was in 2012. Approval of President Obama's handling of international affairs. It's a little hard to see, but the result is pretty clear. The country with the lowest approval ratings continually is Turkey. And so it sort of reinforces the point you made, Uli, about the public opinion attitude towards the United States. Henri, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to say I have to go. I'm sorry, I have another meeting to go to. Thank you very much for inviting me to participate. This was a lot of fun. We should do it more often.
Well, thank you. Now we have all sorts of relationship metaphors, divorce, relations, and we should do it more often. We're going to call it an episode of Friends.
Okay.
Thank you, Henri. Final comments on the Turkish-U.S. relationship or the Turkish-EU relationship from either Ayselin or Sinan or Uli, and then we'll wrap up. Go ahead, Sinan.
Yes, on the Turkey-US, a few words maybe. When we look at, if you have to take a longer perspective of a decade or so, I think first of all, what's happening is really a readjustment of this relationship in the sense that the US has an inclination to pull out from this region for a host of reasons. And Turkey has an inclination to have a larger footprint in this region. And therefore, the old days of a relationship that was mostly dictated by the foreign policy agenda and priorities of Washington are over. This needs a readjustment in the relationship. This is a readjustment in terms of objectives. This is also a readjustment in terms of the power relationship. I'm not talking about the global scale. Obviously, the US is a global power, Turkey at most a regional power. But nonetheless, regionally, this is a new power relationship. And necessarily, this was going to give rise to tension. I think that tension could have been better managed, mostly by Ankara. But I think it was unavoidable to see these elements of tension in the Turkey-US relationship because it is a period of adjustment for the power relationship. That's how I look at it. So I think going down the road, both Ankara and Washington will readjust themselves in terms of their expectations, what they expect from each other, but also what they hope to accomplish, both individually and jointly in the region. And after that sort of more realistic assessment, the relationship will enter hopefully a more productive phase. So that we're really in the midst of that reassessment, and that's why we see, people like Stephen Cook writing these things, which is, a bit provocative. I agree.
Ayselin?
Yeah, I'd like to contribute by telling that I think the hierarchical nature of the relations is getting a little bit different than before. Because the actors, the power actors in the region are increasing, and the domestic policies on both sides are affecting more the relations than before. For example, this issue of Hakan Fidan and also, mentioning the increasing tensions between Turkey and US is not only related with what is going on Turkey, but also the domestic politics in United States. So the success of Obama's government and questioning that, and also the relations with the Congress, I believe that also produces such kind of news. So domestic politics in both sides are now more effective, increasing power actors in the region and neighboring Turkey are more important, and also the changing nature of the hierarchical relations. Looking through a realist perspective, Turkey is no longer a country who serves the national interests of, let me say, another country in all aspects. It is more like now reshaping its own national interest, and also it's becoming, in my opinion, is a more active actor in the region. And Turkey has never been a very good actor of the partner of EU, a very good ally of US, a very well loved partner in Middle East. No, but again, I would like to underline the relations between the EU, Turkey, the relations between US, Turkey will stay in its like friendly framework. However, the hierarchical nature changed a little bit, I think, due to the also changing power relations, increasing actors in these dynamics.
Uli, you have the last word.
Thank you. First of all, I appreciate the comments that Sinan Bey and Ayselin Hanım just made in terms of the changing hierarchy. I think there's tremendous wisdom there. I think I would agree with Professor Barkey that if Syria were to fall apart tomorrow, it would be critical for the United States and Europe and the world that Turkey is there to help out. I'm concerned about some of the positions Turkey is taking now, but I think it can be the most important force for stability in the region. And the last thing, just stepping back, is that I do think that to a certain extent the Obama administration bears some responsibility. We shouldn't forget President Obama's trip to Egypt, but also to Ankara to address the Grand National Assembly and talking about the outreach to the opening up to the Islamic world, that the Islamic world is not the enemy of the United States. But there was perhaps zero follow-up on that. So I think not just in the Middle East, not just in Turkey, but throughout the Muslim world, there was this huge raising of expectations with absolutely no follow-up. So I think that President Obama has a couple of years where maybe he might try to kind of follow up on his earlier comments.
Well, you might argue that the Turks have learned the lesson of great powers like the United States, which is they're damned if they do and they're damned if they don't. And they get criticized either way. I have a feeling that despite the range of our topics, we really only scratched the surface, but it was wonderfully interesting and stimulating. I want to thank Uli and Ayselin and Sinan for joining us, the University of Wisconsin, the University of Illinois, and our partners in Miami, Florida, International University of Miami for joining us. And we'll do it again soon. Thank you all.